Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we'll be looking at the Kingship of Saul in our continuing survey of ancient history as a framework for the Bible. In 1 Samuel, we read about the tabernacle, and remember, the tabernacle had been ordained way back in when the Israelites were in the Sinai Peninsula, in the Sinai wilderness. But the tabernacle by now has become somewhat permanent, and our story opens with the birth of Saul. We're not going to go into that. But the Israelites are now in the land, and yet they're not the only folk in the land. There's also other people groups that are abiding there with them, and that is giving them all sorts of problems. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, we read that the word of the Lord came to, the word of Samuel, came to all of Israel. And now Israel went out to meet the Philistines. The Philistines are one of those people groups that are living in the land, and they meet the Philistines in battle. And they camp beside Ebenezer while the Philistines camp in Aphek. And the Philistines drew up in battle array to meet Israel. And when the battle spread, Israel was defeated before the Philistines, who killed about 4,000 men on the battlefield. Now, the Philistines are living in the coastal area of southern Canaan. They have 5 cities here by this time, probably some other villages as well. And when we think of the Philistines, oftentimes we think of, sort of big and brutish. That's not right. The Philistines are depicted on the walls of Egypt as a people group that nearly invaded Egypt, and they were repulsed by Ramses III in this epic battle, but they ended up settling, or at least a portion of them ended up settling in southern Canaan. Now, the Philistines were more technologically advanced than the Israelites. The Israelites were those mountain people lived up there, but the Philistines had high culture, high pottery. They had the secret of smelting iron. We're already in the Iron Age by this time, but that doesn't mean everybody has that secret. And the Philistines are keeping it a closely guarded monopoly. Now, the Philistines have faced the Israelites, and the Israelites lost. When the people came into the camp, the elders of Israel said, "Why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let's take a secret weapon. Let us take to ourselves from Shiloh the ark of the covenant of the Lord, that it may come among us and deliver us from the power of our enemies." And so the Israelites think, if we bring the ark, we'll get God on our side. We'll force him to win the battle for us. And they do that, thinking that's going to be the outcome. And it is not. In the ensuing battle, we read the people sent to Shiloh, and from there they carried the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who sits above the cherubim. Notice how the ark is described as the throne of God. God sits above the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, they were there with the ark of the covenant of God. And they think that they've got a victory that they can bring about by bringing the ark with them. And instead, the ark is captured, the Israelites are defeated, and one of the wives of the son of the high priest, as she is back in camp, she hears the terrible defeat of the Israelites. And not only have the Israelites been defeated, the ark has been taken, and not only has the ark been taken, these two sons of the high priest, they have both died in battle. And she's giving birth, and she calls the boy Ichabod, saying the kabod, the glory, has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken, and because of her father-in-law and her husband. Both of those had died. Her husband had died in the battle, and her father-in-law, the Eli the high priest, hears the news. He falls over and dies. And she says, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken. And so not only the Israelites defeated, that thing that represents the presence of God. Now, you can't make an image of God, but you can make an image of the throne of God, and that's what the ark was. That had been captured by the Philistines. And it's taken down to the cities, one of the cities of the Philistines, and it's put in one of their temples, because the ark has been captured. And then bad things begin to happen in that city. And for example, the ark is there in the temple, and their pagan idol, they go in the next day, it's lying face down in front of the ark. They say, gee, who did that? They put it back on its pedestal, and they come back the day after that, and it's face down again, and this time the head and the hands of the idol have been broken off, bowing before and defeated before the ark. Well, they say this is a bad thing, and then diseases begin to break out in that city, and so they say, well, let's move the ark to another city. They move the ark to another city, and diseases begin to break out in that city. And they say, this is terrible. What are we going to do? We don't want to destroy the thing. Bad things really might happen to us then. And so they get a team of oxen and a cart, and they put the ark on the cart, and they sort of shoo the ark out of their city, and they aim it in the direction of the Israelites up there in the valley of Sorek. And they sort of follow after to make sure it doesn't turn around and come back. And so imagine this picture. The Israelites are in their field in the Shephelah, in the foothills above the land of the Philistines. And they look up, and here comes the ark of God being carried by an ark, and all of these Philistines behind going shoo shoo. It's almost like they're being brought in captivity, in defeat. Now that's, they don't have chains on or anything. As soon as they get the ark up to the land of the Israelites, they go back home. But it's a wonderful picture how God can bring victory, even though the Israelites, when they tried to use the ark of God to bring victory, that failed miserably. But now the ark is back in the land, and now a new prophet and priest and judge arises, and that's going to be Samuel. So here we are in Beth Shemesh. The ark is going to be here for a time. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verses 4 and 5, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, behold, you have grown old, now, a number of years have now passed, and your sons do not walk in your ways. It's interesting, the sons of Eli, the high priest, didn't walk in the ways of the Lord, and now the sons of Samuel, who's now the high priest, they're not walking in the ways of the Lord either. And so they say to him, now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations. And so Israel requests a king. And this is initiated because of the ungodly successors to Samuel. They want somebody who's godly, and Samuel's sons are not. Now Samuel's godly, but his sons are not following in his footsteps. And they seek the Lord to choose their king. They ask, they go to Samuel and they say, let the Lord raise up a king for us. And it's true that God had promised that they would have a king way back in Deuteronomy chapter 17. And yet, in spite of these aspects, their asking for a king really is rejection of God. Samuel warns them what it really means to have a king, that he's going to draft your sons into his military, he will conscript people, he'll raise the draft to do his plowing and harvesting and to manufacture his weapons of war. He's going to take your daughters for his household duties. He's going to take your lands and vineyards and groves and give them to his retainers. He's going to tax the produce of your land. He will take your servants and animals. And ultimately, he will take you. So, having a king is going to put them in subjection to a greater authority. Now, in 1 Samuel chapter 8, we read that all the elders of Israel gathered together, and they came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, behold, you've grown old. We read this already. Verse 6, but the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and they request a king. The people come to Samuel with their request, and God tells them, it's not that they've rejected you, Samuel, they've rejected me. And so in chapters 9 and 10, a king is going to be chosen. Now, that begins in chapter 9, enter the king. He's not much of a king at this point. Now, there was a man of Benjamin. And remember, Benjamin had been that tribe that at the end of the book of Judges had been reduced to being the very smallest of the tribes because of a terrible story and a terrible war that should never have been fought because of the sin that was in the tribe of Benjamin. And here was a particular man whose his name was Cush, Kish, and he's the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Becheroth, the son of Aphiah, the son of a Benjamite, a mighty man of valor. And he had a son, he's really going to be the star of our show, whose name was Saul, a choice and handsome man, and there was not a more handsome person than he among the sons of Israel. From his shoulders and up he was taller than any of the people. Here was a big old giant fellow, big man, and his name was Saul. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to his son Saul, "Take now with you some of the servants, arise, go search for these missing donkeys." And he goes. He passed through the hill country of Ephraim, passed through the land of Shalisha, but they did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalim. They weren't there. He passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. He goes all over in a big circle searching for these lost donkeys. And finally he says, maybe we can find a seer, and maybe the seer will have seen the donkeys, not just that they passed by, but seers can see things beyond that are right there. And so they go to the seer. They go, that is, to Samuel. And now a day before Saul's coming, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel, saying, about this time tomorrow, I'm going to send you a man from the land of Benjamin, and you shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel, and he will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have regarded my people because their cry has come to me. The same old pattern that we saw in the book of Judges. The people had turned to the Lord to help us, and the Lord is going to raise up a leader. He's going to raise up this Saul. So, Saul comes to Samuel looking for his donkeys, and instead of getting donkeys, well, he's going to get them eventually, but Samuel takes Saul and anoints him as king. Now, that anointing does not mean he's king, but it is promissory. It is saying that eventually you will be something special. You're nothing special now, but this anointing is promissory for good things to come. Thereafter, Samuel called the people together to the Lord at Mizpah, and he said to the sons of Israel, he says, thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I brought Israel up from Egypt, and I delivered you from the hand of the Egyptians and from the power of all the kingdoms that were oppressing you. But you have today rejected your God, who delivers you from all your calamities and your distresses. Yet you said, no, but set a king over us. They didn't want God as king. They wanted a king with skin on. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your clans. We're going to choose a king. Now we're going to see it's Saul, and we already know he's been anointed, so that it's promised that it's going to be Saul, but not everybody knows that. And so they gather. Saul brought all the tribes of Israel near, and the tribe of Benjamin was taken by lot. They cast lots, and out of all the tribes, Benjamin's lot comes to the forefront. I'm not sure if this looks like rolling the dice or however they're doing it, drawing straws. Then he brought the tribe of Benjamin near by its families, and the Matrite family was taken, and Saul, the son of Kish, was taken. It's Saul. And so they looked for him, but he could not be found. Therefore they inquired further of the Lord, has the man come here yet? And the Lord said, yes, he's hiding himself by the baggage. And so they ran, and they took him from there. And when he stood among the people, he was taller than any of the people from his shoulders upward. We have Saul as the reluctant king, but he's the reluctant, good-looking king, head and shoulders above everyone else. And Samuel said to all the people, do you see him whom the Lord has chosen? Surely there's no one like him among all the people. So all the people shouted and said, long live the king. Now, Saul is king, but what image does the description of king evoke? When we say king, sometimes we think of palaces and ornate robes and a crown, and that's not the picture of King Saul. Instead, the next time we see King Saul, he is at the south end of a northbound team of oxen. He's out plowing his field. That's King Saul. And the story develops in 1 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1, where Nahash the Ammonite from the descendants of Lot, but the Ammonites had been enemies of Israel for some time now. Nahash the Ammonite came up and besieged Jabesh Gilead. And whenever you hear the name Gilead, you know that's on the east side of the Jordan River. But this is Jabesh Gilead. And all the men of Jabesh Gilead, they said to Nahash, okay, we surrender. Make a covenant with us. We will serve you. And Nahash the Ammonite said, okay, I'll make this covenant with you. This is the condition, that I will gouge out the right eye of every one of you. Thus I will make it a reproach on all Israel. You want to surrender? That's fine. Here's my surrender terms. I get to gouge out your right eye of every man in the whole city. And so they say, well, maybe we won't surrender. And so the elders of Jabesh said to him, let us alone for 7 days, that we may send messengers throughout the territory of Israel. And if there's no one to deliver us, we'll come out to you. We'll surrender. And so they have 7-day period of grace. And Jabesh thinks, well, nobody, Israel is just a bunch of scattered tribes. They're not going to come to anybody's defense. Now, behold, Saul is coming from the field. He's out there been plowing King Saul has been plowing his field with his oxen. Farmer king. And he said, what's the matter with the people that they weep? Because they'd heard the news. And so they related to him the words of the men of Jabesh. And the Spirit of God came upon Saul mightily, and when he heard these words, he became very angry. And he took a yoke of oxen, presumably the yoke that he'd been plowing his field with, and cut them in pieces. Now remember when we saw this take place, where there had been a cutting in pieces prior. That had been taken place, remember, in the territory of Benjamin. This is Benjamin, in the town of Gibeah. Guess what? Saul is actually from Gibeah. And it had been a terrible cutting. A woman had been raped. Instead here, this is a call to action. And he cuts these yoke of oxen in pieces and sent them throughout the territory of Israel by the hand of messengers. Now, Israel, you've got 12 tribes, so I'm assuming you had around 12 pieces. And the messengers say, this is Saul's, his word, whoever does not come out after Saul and after Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. And then the dread of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out as one man. There is a unity that we haven't seen since the days of Joshua, and this unity comes upon all the land of Israel, and they come out to Saul. And the next morning Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp at the morning watch, and they struck down the Ammonites until the heat of the day. And they have great victory over the Ammonites who were besieging Jabesh Gilead. And those who survived were scattered, so that no 2 of them were left together. So great victory over the Ammonites. The people then said to Samuel, who is he that said, shall Saul reign over us? Bring them in, that we may put them to death. Suddenly there's a big turn of events. Saul has brought them victory. And anybody who were the naysayers, because there had been, it seems like there always are, let's bring those people, and we're going to put them to death. And Saul said, no, not a man shall be put to death this day, for today the Lord has accomplished deliverance in Israel. And so Saul says, no, it's going to be unity and peace among the Israelites. And that's a wonderful thing. That's a good thing. Then Samuel said to the people, come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom. They are going to renew the kingdom, renewing the covenant there at Gilgal. So all the people went to Gilgal. This is the place where, when the Israelites had first come into the land, before they had taken Jericho, they had gone up to Gilgal. They had renewed themselves. And here they do that again. And there they made Saul king before the Lord at Gilgal. So Saul now officially, in the eyes of everyone, he becomes king. Now, the story of Saul can be seen in 3 acts, each of which, at least the first 2 acts, and the third one's going to have a few scenes too, each which has Scene 1, Scene 2, and Scene 3. We saw Act 1, Scene 1, where Saul meets Samuel. He's looking for donkeys, and he's anointed by him. Now in Scene 2, he has success in battle with the help of God. And finally in Scene 3, and I'm not going to go into any detail, but Saul, he's fighting the Philistines, and Saul runs into some failure. For example, he makes an oath saying, anybody who eats before we win the battle against the Philistines is going to get killed. Jonathan doesn't hear the news, his son. And Saul says, well, that's it. Jonathan ate, and I'm going to kill him. And the people say, no, you can't do that. He didn't know. He was innocent. So there's some failure that takes place in chapters 13 and 14. When we hear the story of Saul and his armor bearer, and we're going to see the same thing in a bit with the Philistine Goliath and his armor bearer, we ought to remember the artwork that we're looking here is a Mycenaean blade that depicts the Mycenaeans from a similar time in history where they had not these little tiny shields like we see later on in history, but these big body shields. And in this case, they're holding these shields and a spear, but those shields were so big that the armor bearer would carry the shield, and then the warrior standing next to him, he would carry the offensive weapon. There's a picture of one of those big figure-8 shields. Again, this is Mycenaean. But the Israelites seem to have adopted that sort of armament, at least when they could get it, which wasn't usually. In fact, in the entire army of the Israelites, you had two sets of armor at this point. You had Saul and Jonathan. They had kingly and princely armor. And everybody else, they were sort of reduced to fighting with whatever they could get. And that usually ended up being your shovel, your rake, or your pickaxe. In other words, they were fighting with their farm implements. Well, in 1 Samuel 15, Samuel says to Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you as king over his people, over Israel. And now therefore listen to the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish Amalek for what he did to Israel, how he set himself against him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Saul is sent down to bring the judgment of God against the Amalekites for the way in the past, and it has continued, the way in the past they have been a thorn in the flesh of the Israelites, setting themselves up to try to kill off the Israelites. And so he goes down to judge Amalek, and he gets great victory. Now he's told, go and strike Amalek, utterly destroy all that he has, do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child, infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. And Saul defeats the Amalekites from Havilah as you go to Shur, which is east of Egypt. And he captures Agag. Now we're going to see that name later on. He captures Agag, the king of the Amalekites, but he captures him alive, utterly destroys all the people with the edge of the sword. But he keeps Agag. Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and all that was good, and were not willing to destroy them utterly, but everything despised and worthless, that they utterly destroyed. If they didn't want it, they destroyed it. If they wanted to keep it, they kept it alive. Now, Samuel shows up, and Saul says, Samuel shows up, and Samuel says, as the Lord has much delight in burnt offerings, why didn't you obey? And Saul says, well, I was keeping it for the Lord. Like when my granddaughter one time, it was before dinner, because usually she asks Grandpa, can I have something, a cookie or something like that, and Grandpa just gives her cookies all the time. But it was just before dinner, and she was a little girl, much younger then, and she asked Grandpa, can I have a cookie? And I said, honey, you shouldn't have the cookie right now because it'll spoil your dinner. You can have one after dinner, but not right now. And a few minutes passed. From the other room, I could hear, cookie jar sounds, clunking, and they don't realize that sound can travel at that age. And so I went in there, and she had the cookie jar down, and she had a cookie in her hand. And I said, honey, I told you couldn't have a cookie. And she says, I was getting it for you. Well, Saul says the same thing, and Samuel answered, has the Lord as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. And he says, and this is a hint of what's coming later on in 1 Samuel, for rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king. And as Samuel turned to go, Saul seized the edge of his robe. Samuel says, I'm not with you anymore. And Saul seizes his robe, and it tore. And that tearing is going to become a sign, because Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today and has given it to your neighbor who is better than you." And of course that neighbor is going to be David. So, in our Act 2, notice scene 1, Saul meets David again, or Saul meets Samuel again. In scene 1, Act 1, Saul has met Samuel. This time there's a meeting of Saul and Samuel, and Samuel condemns Saul. Saul is condemned by Samuel. The next story that we see, again there's success in battle, but this time it is David who has the great success in battle. Now it's on behalf of Saul. David is fighting on behalf of Saul, and David meets the giant Goliath. Now, 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 3. Now the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they were gathered at Succoth, which belongs to Judah, and they were camped between Succoth and Azekah in Ephes Damim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and camped in the valley of Elah. And they drew up in battle array to encounter the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on one side, while the Israelites stood on the mountain on the other side, with the valley in between them. And then a champion came out from the armies of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, a cubit is the length from your elbow to the tip of your finger. So the length of a cubit depends on how big you are, but roughly we can average it out to maybe around 18 inches, which puts Goliath, that puts him 9 feet and change. The tallest man ever known in modern history was Robert Waldo. He died in 1940. He was standing 8 feet 11 inches, but he was not a healthy man. Even though he was very tall, it was some sort of problem, and very tall but very unhealthy. By contrast, Goliath is, every picture of him, he's a huge man but a healthy warrior. Dead Sea Scrolls for this passage have a slightly different reading. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the scrolls that was found in Cave 4, instead of 6 cubits, it says 4 cubits in a span. That would still make Goliath, 6'9" or so. It's still a very, very, very big guy, especially when you consider that the average person living in that day was probably, living around the Mediterranean, was probably around, 5'4", 5'3". So he was towering over any people of his day. Not only does the Dead Sea Scrolls say that, the Vaticanus, the Codex Vaticanus, the Greek translation, and this is one of the earliest copies that we have of a Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, that supports that same reading. And also in Josephus, when he's describing Goliath, he's a first century historian, he's going by the copies of the Scriptures that he had in his day, he gives us the same reading. So we don't necessarily need to think that he's, so tall that as to exceed human imagination or human experience, but still a very, very big soldier. And what's more, he's equipped in all of the latest gadgetry of the world of that day. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was clothed with scale armor, which weighs 5,000 shekels of bronze. He had a bronze greaves on his legs, bronze javelins slung between his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. That's why he's going to have an armor bearer. He's got a spear that's so big, that's about all he can handle. And the head of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier also walked before him. So it's not just David against a normal person, but David against this great big old giant fellow. Think linebacker. The biggest football player that you can imagine, and also his armor bearer as well. And David is going against him with a sling. Now, a sling was considered a weapon of war of that day. This wasn't like a little slingshot. You actually had slingers that would be used in military function, but they're considered light armor, light infantry. And so David, he goes up against Goliath. We read he puts his hand into his bag, took from it a stone, slung it, struck the Philistine on his forehead. Now, later Greeks would actually have the helmet where it would protect your forehead, but the the Philistines of this period did not have armor like that. It would not protect his forehead. Forehead would be open. Struck the Philistine on his forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. And then David runs up and takes the Philistine's sword and cuts off, I'm not sure what the armor bearer was doing, but cuts off the head of Goliath. It's an interesting contrast to note that earlier we spoke of the Ark of the Covenant in the presence of the false god of the Philistines, the god Dagon. Here David is against the Philistine Goliath. In that story, the Ark had been captured by the Philistines, placed in the temple of Dagon. Here Goliath looks at David, and he thinks he's won the victory too. He thinks it's going to be an easy victory. And instead, remember, Dagon had been found face down before the Ark, and now Goliath falls on his face before David. In the Ark versus Dagon story, Dagon had been found with his head removed, which led to a enduring practice. Here, David against Goliath. David cuts off Goliath's head and keeps it as an enduring trophy. In that previous story, Dagon had been seen by all to be a dead idol of stone. And here, Goliath is obviously dead now that his head's cut off, and the Lord is seen to be the living God. That's how he's described in 1 Samuel 17:26. Well, in our overall story of Saul, though, you see we had success in battle with the help of David, but now again Saul has failure, just like he had failure with Samuel and Jonathan. So again, now he runs into a series of failures. Again, with this time David, he hadn't been introduced before, and that failure takes the form of jealousy. As they are coming back from this battle and other battles as well, a new song begins to be sung by the people, and they are singing that Saul has slain his thousands, and that sounds nice, but they're adding a new line, and David has slain his 10,000s. And everybody loves the song except Saul, and Saul grows in jealousy against David. Now, David then is forced to become a fugitive. We have in 1 Samuel chapter 19, he flees from the presence of Saul. He's assisted by Saul's daughter, that has actually been given to David as his wife, Michal. And she hides David and assists David against her own father. And David is also assisted by the Lord. The Lord sort of comes into the picture. David manages to escape Saul. We come to chapter 20, and David and Jonathan make a covenant where even the son of Saul has befriended David. They've become sort of best friends. Now, Jonathan is quite a bit older than David. David's young, Jonathan's older, but they enter into a covenant. And David again is assisted, this time by Abimelech. David's on the run, and he comes to the place where the tabernacle is. Remember it in Shiloh. And Abimelech, the high priest, helps him by giving him some food and also giving him the only sword that Abimelech has is the sword of Goliath that had been kept as a trophy, and David is given that. The very fact that David can wield that maybe hints that David is not this little tiny kid, but he's quite a bit bigger. In 1 Samuel 21:10, we see that David flees down to the Philistine city of Gath, and he finds refuge there for a time. He pretends to be insane, and they buy it. Of course, he's the big Philistine killer, but he finds refuge there. And then after that, he's assisted by the king of Moab. He goes to Moab. Now, why would he go to Moab? That's the traditional enemies of Israel. But remember, David's great-grandma is Ruth, who is from Moab. And so he finds some refuge in Moab for a time. In the ensuing chapters 20 through 26, we have various pursuits where Saul is pursuing David. In the first pursuit, second pursuit, third pursuit, the first time Jonathan helps David and comes and gives him a report of what's really going on. In the second pursuit, David is on the run and he's hiding in a cave, and Saul comes along and says, "Gee, I need to use the restroom. Here's a nice convenient cave," and goes sit in that cave, and David comes up behind him and cuts off a piece of his robe. as if to say, look, I could have killed you, Saul. Instead, look how close I get. That's the evidence. And Saul repents, but it's not a repentance that continues, because there is ultimately a third pursuit. And this time David comes up while Saul is sleeping and takes his spear and his jug and says, see, I could have killed you again. And in each of these occasions, David is assisted by either the circumstances. Once he's assisted by Abigail, the wife of Nabal. Another time he's again assisted by going down to Gath. He returns to one of those Philistine cities and finds refuge there. And at the end of the story, we finally come to 1 Samuel chapter 28. Now, David, by this time, is sort of out of the picture. In fact, it looks like he's going to be there, but he's not. He's in one of the cities of the Philistines, the city of Ziklag. And meanwhile, it comes about in those days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel. There's going to be this epic confrontation between Israel and the Philistines. David's actually on the side of the Philistines at this point. But the Philistines really don't want him around because they figure he might change sides because, after all, he's Jewish. He might turn back to the Israelites. And so the Philistines are going to go up to that valley of Jezreel, that big open space that cuts through the mountains, and they're going to fight on this valley of Jezreel against the Israelites. We read, here's a blow-up of that area. The Philistines gathered together and came and camped in Shunem, that's on the eastern side of that valley of Jezreel. Meanwhile, the Israelites have camped to the south of them. Saul gathered all of Israel together, and they camped in Gilboa. That's a mountain that stretches right out into the middle of the valley. And so you had the Philistines on one side, Saul and the Israelites on the other. Here's a picture of that wide open valley with the mountain of Gilboa stretching out into the middle of the valley. Now when Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was afraid, and his heart trembled greatly. And when Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or the prophets. All of the ways of approaching God seemed to fail. And then Saul said to his servants, seek for me a woman who is a medium. Now earlier Saul had issued an ordinance that all mediums were to be put to death, but he says, go find one, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor. Now Saul is going to then go to Endor. Now Endor is actually on the other side of Shunem, so he has to make this midnight journey to get to Endor, but he disguised himself by putting on other clothes. And he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And they come to this medium, this spiritualist, in order to try to contact Saul. The woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up, Samuel. Bring up Samuel for me. And when the woman saw Samuel, now this, scholars aren't sure what to do with this. Apparently the woman, I think what was happening, she would put on a show and she would pretend I'm going to contact the dead, and maybe she'd do a little bit of ventriloquism and sort of, I'm whoever you called, and put on a show, and I think that's what's happening here. She's actually planning to put on a show, but then the passage says, when the woman saw Samuel, the passage actually says, the narrator tells us she saw Samuel, and it scared her to death, because she wasn't expecting it. She was going to expect to tell this visitor what he wanted to hear and make up some things and get paid for it. And instead, she saw Samuel. And now, let me just say, that doesn't normally happen. This is a very extraordinary circumstance. Mediums do not normally see dead people. They normally put on a show. But in this case, God allowed it to happen. And she saw Samuel, and she cried out with a loud voice, and the woman spoke to Saul, saying, why have you deceived me? For you are Saul. The king said to her, do not be afraid, but what do you see? And the woman said to Saul, I see a divine being. Actually, the Hebrew word there is Elohim, a godlike one, coming up out of the earth. And he said to her, what is his form? Because apparently Saul could not see this vision. And she said, an old man is coming up, and he is wrapped with a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel. How did he know that it was Samuel? The last time Saul had seen Samuel, he had seen that robe. Remember, he had grabbed Samuel, and Samuel had moved away, and the robe had torn, and that had become a picture of how the land of Israel would be torn from the grasp of Saul. And so here this old man is pictured, wrapped with a robe, and Saul hears and knows that it's Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and did homage. And Samuel comes, at least in vision, and he says, because of what you've done, you're going to be here in the grave. You're going to die. And sure enough, the next day, as the battle is ensued, the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines, and they fell slain on Mount Gilboa. Here we're looking at Gilboa this time from the east, looking toward the west. And they fell on Mount Gilboa, and Saul meets his end. Remember, Act 3, Scene 1, we'd had this third meeting. The first meeting had been where Saul meets Samuel and was anointed. At the second meeting, Saul had met Samuel and was condemned by him. At this third meeting, Saul meets Samuel, and his death now is foretold. So the story of Saul contains three meetings. One in Scene 1, or one in Act 1, one in Act 2, one in Act 3. And on the next day, there is battle, just like we'd seen battle previously. There is, this time, failure in that battle. And Saul is struck down, and as he lies dying, he doesn't want to fall into the hands of the Philistines because he is terrified of what they will do to him if he's still alive. So he says to his armor bearer, please, 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 kill me. And his armor bearer says, you're the anointed of God, I'm not going to do that. And Saul falls on his own sword to commit suicide rather than to be captured. And so ends the life of Saul. We read that it came about on the next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain that they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his weapons and sent them throughout the land of the Philistines to carry the good news to the house of their idols and to the people. And they put his weapons in the temple of Ashtaroth, and they fastened his body to the walls of Bethshan. Bethshan is on the east side of the valley of Jezreel. And here they fastened the body of Saul. Now when the inhabitants of Jabesh-Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, that is, cutting off his head and leaving his body on ignoble display like that on the walls of Bethshan, we read that all the valiant men rose and walked all night and took the body of Saul and the bodies of his son from the wall of Bethshan, and they came to Jabesh and burned them there. So the men now that's an honorable disposing of the body. Where the men of Jabesh-Gilead, remember Jabesh-Gilead was that city that Saul had helped to rescue at the beginning of his kingship. They show him honor at the end here. And thus ends the reign of Saul, which will pave the way now for a new king to come, and that king will ultimately be David.